Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's Tech Forum session. I'm Tim Middleton, Product Manager and Retailer Liaison at BookNet. Welcome to AI in Publishing, Your Questions Answered. Before we get started, BookNet Canada acknowledges that its operations are remote and our colleagues contribute their work from the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Wyandot, the Mi'kmaq, the Ojibwe of Fort William First Nation, the Three Fires Confederacy of First Nations, which includes the Ojibwa, the Adawa, and the Potawatomi, and the Métis. The original nations and peoples of the lands we now call Beaton, Brampton, Guelph, Halifax, Thunder Bay, Toronto, Vaughan, and Windsor. We encourage you to visit the native-land.ca website to learn more about the peoples whose land you are joining from today. Moreover, BookNet endorses the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada and supports an ongoing shift from gatekeeping to space-making in the book industry. The book industry has long been an industry of gatekeeping. Anyone who works at any stage of the book supply chain carries a responsibility to serve readers by publishing, promoting, and supplying works that represent the wide extent of human experiences and identities in all that complicated intersectionality. We at BookNet are committed to working with our partners in the industry as we move towards a framework that supports space-making, which ensures that marginalized creators and professionals all have the opportunity to contribute, work, and lead. For our webinar today, if you are having difficulties with Zoom or have any tech-related questions, please put your questions in the chat, or you can email techforum@booknetcanada.ca. We're providing live ASL and closed captioning for this presentation. To see the captions, please find the Show Subtitle button in the Zoom menu at the bottom of your screen. We'd also like to remind attendees of the Code of Conduct. Please be kind and respectful. Please do not record these sessions. We have a zero-tolerance policy for violations of our Code of Conduct, so please report any harassment to the Tech Forum team. Today's webinar will be more interactive than our usual sessions. After I go over these housekeeping notes, George will kick things off with a quick update on key developments since his previous presentation. From there, we'll dive into an extended Q&A. So please feel free to ask your burning questions about AI's impact and potential applications in the book industry. If you'd like to unmute your mic or turn on your camera, just click the raise hand button to let our team know to temporarily enable your mic and camera controls. You can also participate by using the chat or QA box. A quick heads up that this webinar is being recorded, including any audio or video you share, and the recording will be publicly available after the session. With that, let's get started. I'm pleased to introduce our speaker, George Walkley. George is an independent strategy consultant and expert in artificial intelligence in publishing. Working with the Independent Publishers Guild, he has delivered training on AI to delegates from more than 200 publishers worldwide across trade, children's, professional, and academic segments. Prior to establishing his consulting practice in 2020, George spent 15 years at Hachette UK, where he held senior roles in digital, strategy, and marketing. He is also an experienced non-executive director and startup advisor, and a doctoral candidate at Bristol Business School. Over to you, George.
Tim, thank you very much indeed, and thank you to all of your colleagues from BookNet Canada who have arranged this afternoon's webinar. I'm just going to check before I start that my audio and video is coming through clearly and that the pace is good for our excellent ASL interpreters. If there are any issues, please let me know as we go. I'm going to talk for no more than 10 minutes or so before I take your questions, and I know that many of you will have attended the previous session in September. As Tim said, I'm a strategy consultant and a director of a number of publishing businesses. I was asked to develop training on AI by the Independent Publishers Guild following a member survey in 2023, which, barely 5 months after the first release of ChatGPT, showed that AI was the #1 topic of concern for publishers surveyed. We believe that it is the first independent, accredited training anywhere in the world that is specifically designed for the needs of the publishing industry, looking at AI. Quick update, I think we are at 263 organizations as of this week that have received that training in 13 countries. And what I hope this gives is a useful aggregate perspective on AI transformation in the industry. But this is a very, very fast-moving landscape. So I thought it would be useful to give a very quick update on what has happened since last September before we take your questions. And I would split this up into 2 elements. The first is principles, and the second is events. I'm happy to say that looking back at the 8 principles that we discussed in September for balanced and ethical AI use, I would say that those principles still hold absolutely true. They have not been overtaken by events. On the other hand, the landscape has moved a lot in that time, and I'm going to highlight in a very quick way 10 things that have happened that I think are particularly significant. In September, I talked about the fact that AI was being built ever more closely into the applications that we all use every day. Since then, that trend has continued. Our phones have AI built in. As of January 2025, both Microsoft and Google integrated their AI product as a standard option within most tiers for Microsoft Office and Google Workspace, to the extent that it's hard to turn off. AI has gone from being an optional extra to an opt-out product in most cases. Secondly, we've seen incredible leaps in performance, but also reduction in cost for use of platforms. In fact, over a period of a year, the cost of using OpenAI's 4.0 model decreased in real terms by about 92%, driven by increased efficiencies. DeepSeek, the new Chinese model, which has got a lot of attention in the first quarter of this year, claims a further 90% saving. However, cost and sustainability remain key issues for us to consider with AI. Hallucination and the accuracy of AI models is naturally a hot topic for publishers. Across the top 3 consumer models, we now see a benchmark hallucination rate of about 1.33%, which is the best ever. But at the same time, in the last 6 months, we've seen examples of where generative models go wrong at scale. The Apple Intelligence product on many of our iPhones has had issues as it tries to summarize news notifications and twists the news that it's summarizing. Similarly, the book club app Fable, which used AI to generate bespoke end-of-year summaries for its users, suffered a reputational hit when some of those summaries were found to be inappropriate and, in some cases, deeply offensive. There is clearly a problem with generative outputs at that kind of scale, and it points to the need for human-in-the-loop review of outputs. We see an ongoing proliferation of new models from different companies and also new models within the same AI platforms. This week, as I looked at the two platforms that I use most, OpenAI offered me a choice of 7 different models that could answer my query, and Google Gemini 5. The selection of what is the right model, the right balance of capability and cost, is now a key issue for publishers to think through. And it's interesting that in the last week, Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, has explicitly talked about a roadmap that has fewer models and less selection to make life easier on consumers. Very excitingly, we're seeing AI develop from being a content creator to an agent that will act on our behalf. So-called agentic AI systems will go away and carry out a task for us on the web, whether that is research, retrieving data from a retailer sales portal, looking at competitor websites, or any one of a number of other functions. OpenAI's Operator product, which is rolling out now, is sort of the first mass market example of this. But I think in a very workflow-led business like publishing, it's potentially significant. We also see a lot of tension around copyright, how AI models are trained, and the balance between publishers and technology platforms. Here in the UK, there is an interesting bellwether for the rest of the world. Our government here asked a venture capitalist to write a set of recommendations for AI and national strategy, and they have adopted all 50 of those recommendations. At the moment, there is a public consultation going on here about copyright and the balance between technology and publishers, something I know that Canada is not new to. At the moment, there is a very strong sense that government is prioritizing the need of technology companies over a vibrant and successful publishing sector. And I think that is a theme we will see emerge in other jurisdictions. The question of fair use, which the AI companies rely on as their defense for using copyrighted material for training, goes on and on. In November, OpenAI won an early court ruling against the media company Raw Story, when Raw Story was unable to demonstrate to a US court that there had been a harm as a result of training. In the last couple of weeks, we've seen the balance swing back in the opposite direction. Meta's allegedly egregious use of LibGen and other pirated ebook libraries has drawn attention to their practices. And last week, the legal publisher Thomson Reuters won an important ruling in Delaware as regards training based on its Westlaw product. These cases will continue to be litigated for some time, but I think it's still a very, very dynamic landscape. Interestingly, the US Copyright Office has been trying to give clarity on some other aspects of AI. In particular, highlighting that material created by humans using AI is theoretically capable of copyright protection, but it is a case-by-case determination, dependent on the level of control exercised by the human operator. Mere prompts are not enough to guarantee that control. At the same time as all of this, there is deep concern from creators, authors, illustrators, photographers, translators, and so many others, concerned at the use of their work for training and concerned at their future economic prospects if AI can replicate their work. The most recent symptom of this is the auction house Christie's announcing its first ever sale of AI-generated work. And so far, many thousands of artists have signed an open letter demanding that that sale be cancelled. Tensions between creatives, publishers, and technologists will persist. And then finally, we see a lot of tension about AI in the workplace. Overall, nearly a quarter of the workforce, at least here in the UK, is using AI at least on a weekly basis. but half of those are not comfortable admitting it to their colleagues and their line manager. So there is a potential lack of transparency about how AI is used. Very seriously, fewer than half of executives say that their organization has clear policies in this area. In some adjacent sectors, we're seeing AI become a core part of the product and experience. That's also true in education. At the moment in publishing, as you'll see in a moment, AI is largely being used as a general productivity booster. But I think all of this points to the fact that there are important questions for all of us as leaders and managers as to how AI is rolled out to our teams. So very briefly, I wanted to give a very fast update on where I see AI being used in publishing organizations. On the most basic level, with nothing more than access to a secure large language model, we see AI being used for tasks like ideation, repurposing content, translation, albeit in a fairly limited fashion, marketing planning and the production of marketing assets, SEO, accessibility, and generating metadata and alt text, analyzing data and automating tasks, in some cases, teaching and upskilling colleagues, and finally, in creating custom models. Pretty much across the board in the publishers that I work with, AI is being used as it is built into Adobe's Creative Suite. Adobe Firefly is, I think, the most commonly used AI product that I see day to day as I interact with publishers. And it's one of the only ones with very robust guarantees about the licensing of its training data. Over the course of this year, as agentic tools, AI agents, become more commonplace, I think we will see AI stepping in and carrying out more repetitive tasks. Back when I was a publisher, one of my teams spent hours a week doing nothing but logging into various retailer portals to download data and bring it back into our own systems. That's the sort of task that really ought to have been made available via an API. But where the retailer hasn't made an API, I see sales agent, AI agents taking over that function. And agentic AI may also help us significantly with market research and report generation. For some publishers, AI is now being integrated into their core product or content. Pearson, the textbook publisher, uses AI to produce adjunct material for its science textbooks, which are in use at tens of thousands of institutions. At the other end of the scale, a small scientific publisher, Burley Dodds, where I'm proud to serve on the board of directors, has created its own AI model trained on its content that allows users to ask questions of the catalog and get more data and interaction. Finally, for publishers that just want to buy a finished product, there are plenty of services out there that offer capability to publishers in particular areas with a product and user experience layer wrapped around them. I should emphasize that I'm listing these for purpose of illustration. This is not an endorsement of any of these services, though many of them are very good. For authoring of books, there's a tool called Clio. For manuscript evaluation, a company called Storywise helps editors to evaluate manuscripts, albeit that the final decision is always with the editor. For scholarly and trade workflows, there are platforms like Kotahi and Veristage. Proofing, copy editing is one of the most sensitive areas, and I must admit it's one where I've historically been suspicious about the impact of AI given its accuracy. But there is a new platform called Editrix, created by a former editor at Penguin Random House, India, and there's likewise a platform called ProofCheck that copy edits. Translation is done through commercial services like HeyGen and Nuanced, marketing through services like Zapier and Shimmer. Finally, and very interestingly for publishers, video and audio assets can be created inexpensively and quickly using services like 11 Labs and Synthesia. And I'm interested to note that actually only today, 11 Labs has announced a tie-in with Spotify, which will now accept full audiobooks generated through 11 Labs on its service. So what I hope this gets across is that there is a very broad range of usage. Nobody I know is doing all of these things. In each case, it is a matter of working out what is most relevant to a particular publisher. But I hope that this list gives you some thought starters. Now, very briefly, before we take your questions, a few quick commercial messages. Next week, we have the Independent Publishers Guild Conference. I'm delighted to be chairing a session with Will Crook, Publishing Licensing Services, and the brilliant Ed Newton-Rex of Fairly Trained, who is joining us by video from California. Online registration is available, and I think it promises to be a great session. Secondly, the IPG does offer quarterly training sessions on AI, which I have been asked to make you aware of. That includes a quarterly session on North American time for the US and Canadian market. So if anyone's interested, do let me know. If you don't get a chance to answer your question today, my email and LinkedIn are on the screen. Please do get in touch with me. I'd be very happy to answer questions that you have. I will make the slides that I've shown available for download from my website, and you can visit that to obtain them. Give me half an hour or so after the webinar to get them live. Finally, I publish a free weekly email newsletter on AI, which is intended to be a 5-minute read highlighting the 6 or 7 things that are most significant that week in AI and publishing. If you don't subscribe already, I would be delighted if you considered doing so. So, with all of that in mind, thank you very much. It's now time, very importantly, to turn over to your questions. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what is on your mind with publishing and AI, and hopefully giving you some ideas and some answers. Thank you again.
Thank you, George. That was awesome. Thank you for the update. If you haven't seen the earlier presentation, please check out our website. The links are there available in the webinar chat. We do have some questions coming in, and I just want to remind people that it would be really nice to have this more interactive. If you want to have the mic turned on and your video, just raise your hand down at the bottom there, and our team will make sure we unmute your mic. I'm just going to start with the first question I have here. I'm keeping up in Google Docs, not with an AI. So the first question, can you share an example of how people in the book industry are using AI to increase productivity? I know that you alluded to some stuff there, but if you want to go a little more into that.
Let me give a very specific example to get started. One of the common denominators that I find across all sizes and shapes of publisher is a reliance on manual process, and in particular, people spending a great deal of time on Microsoft Excel-based tasks. This is something that often causes frustration. It takes a great deal of time, and it introduces the possibility of manual error as people go through. One of the things that I've seen done consistently successfully is using AI to help automate those tasks by writing either VBA macros to run in Excel, or alternatively writing Python scripts for more advanced applications. So the example I often give here is a university press where a sales administrator was spending time manually collating data from multiple sources. Frustrating for that individual and not a great return on their time for the business. Using AI, they've automated that process. It's been tested, it's running very accurately, and they're happy with what they're seeing. And that person now has time to talk to customers and to really be focused on sales strategy, which is a better use of their time. So I think that's a really nice example of where AI can add value to someone's role. I guess the corollary to that question is whether the use of AI in making people more productive is going to be harmful for employment in publishing. And this is something that I'm very sensitive to, that I talked about in September. And the evidence that I see to date is relatively clear. So far, the sort of productivity boost that I'm seeing is on the order of, say, 5% of someone's working week saved. They're perhaps getting a couple of hours back. That is not on a level, it's not so transformational that someone's going to get rid of their role as a result. It's just making them incrementally more productive. And that can have one of two impacts. Either it makes an unmanageable workload a little bit more manageable, or it means that people solve for opportunity cost and are able to really think about, rather than, there are 5 things I wanted to do, and previously I had time for 4. Maybe I'm now able to do 5. But this is not at a level where it's taking over from human beings, not least because the human being still needs to look at the output and determine if it is accurate.
Thanks, George. That does sort of provoke a question from me. You mentioned they validated, when they collated the information. What does that look like? How do you validate what is coming out of AI? Are you just simply doing it against your manual work, or?
Sure. It's a really good question. And I think a lot of it depends on how the work is being done. If every time you get 6 different spreadsheets to collate, you put them into ChatGPT and ask it to collate them, it will do that. But every single time it does it, there is the potential for hallucination and error. And so quality control becomes a real issue. The better technique is to use AI to write something like a macro or a script that will run. AI is quite good at that coding task. In general, the training data for coding is quite robust. And in general, with some iterative development, those scripts work quite well. But the really important part is that once that script is being run as a macro or in Python, it's not referencing AI each time, it's running independently. And that means that every time it's run, you can rely on it to have a level of consistency that a natural AI output would not necessarily have. So I think really thinking through, are you solving the problem directly within an AI tool? Are you solving the problem indirectly by using AI to write you a script that's run independently? Is a really good question to ask. And then if you're going down the latter route, which is what I recommend, then yes, it's a before and after comparison. Okay, here is our test data. This is the manual output. This is the automated output. Do those correspond? There are automated ways of checking that, or there are manual ways of checking it. But either way, it's worth investing that time at the top of the process to make sure that you're happy with those outputs so you can then rely on that tool in future.
Very, very insightful. Thank you. I will go back to our regularly scheduled questions. Ted Gioa predicts that even when AI can adequately handle a job, people will pay more for a human being. What are your thoughts on that? You sort of alluded to the human in the middle, but what about costs?
It's a really interesting question, and I think it kind of depends on the type of information that we're looking at. Not all jobs, not all types of content or information are created equal there. There are some things that are, there's a level of quite generic information which I think people will just get through AI and be happy with. So, for example, since ChatGPT released a task function, I use it to go away, look at various news sites, and pull together a summary of what happens each day, just so I keep up to date. I prefer it to something like Google Alerts because it actually does a little bit more curation and presentation of that data. Now, in that case, I'm perfectly happy with what I'm getting just for that daily update task. On the other hand, if I want a really insightful, well-written piece of investigative journalism about AI, I'm not going to get that from an AI itself. I'm prepared to subscribe to the New York Times. I'm prepared to have a voluntary subscription, it seems, to The Guardian, because I know that I will get very good quality journalism from those sources. So I think, without dodging the question, it depends on what you're looking for. The commodity basic information, I think people may be very happy to get from AI and won't need a human in the loop. On the other hand, I think for the really good quality insight, people will want the human touch to that. And I think while book publishing as a whole has not gone particularly aggressively into AI generated content, it is very interesting to see how the news media particularly is adapting to this. John Micklethwaite, the editor-in-chief of Bloomberg, talked about the fact that about 1/3 of Bloomberg's journalism now has an AI element sitting alongside the human being. The AI may help with the data gathering, it may help with the basic presentation of facts, but then there is a human who is adding context and judgment and value to that. So I think, in summary, it's a broadly mixed economy of AI and human, but I absolutely think there are areas where humanity has real advantages over AI.
Right. And I suppose we're still early on in AI. Some of this will play out, and as models get better.
As models get better, yeah, do they become more competitive with human beings?
Mhm.
One of my friends said something the other week, which I really liked, which is that generative AI is basically about probability and humanity is about possibility. And I really liked that framing of it. The fact is, if you are looking at a very sort of structured and standardized area. So let's take an area of publishing like some elements of genre fiction. By the way, I started my career in genre fiction. I love genre fiction, but the reality is, if you want to generate a very standard mystery, science fiction or fantasy or romance novel that hews very closely to the standards of that genre, AI can do kind of adequate job at that. On the other hand, AI can't do a superb job. AI couldn't be an N.K. Jemisin or an Ursula Le Guin. And there's no way that AI could come up with Joyce's Ulysses is the example that I always give, because there is no way that AI could come up with something that was so fundamentally new in form and content from everything that had been seen before, because AI is always looking backward at what it's seen previously.
Thank you. We are getting more questions, and I will remind people if they want the mic or the video, just raise your hand. We are getting your questions through the chat as well, or the Q&A. I want to ask one that did come in through the Q&A here. Are those specialist products for publishing you listed actually covered under copyright laws?
It's a very, very mixed bag there. The reality is that you have to look at the individual service and also the use case. If you are looking for something on which you can assert copyright, you need to be very, very careful with them. And you also need to understand the underlying model that they are using, because each foundation model has its own terms and conditions governing ownership. So, for example, on OpenAI, there is a standard policy that the user owns the output and is free to use it, including for commercial reasons. That's a very simple one. On the other hand, with Anthropic and Claude, as I understand it, the user does not own the output. The user is given a limited license by the platform to use it, including for commercial purposes. But that limited license only exists so long as that user is in compliance with their terms and conditions. So if you do something to break the T's and C's, you no longer have the license to use that content. It's also true that looking down that list of products that I showed you, there are some which are very transparent in their sources of training data and what models that they use. So, for example, I know that, say, Storywise, for example, works from licensed data and doesn't work with sort of general public models. There are others on that list where I myself am less clear on what they have trained on. And so that's a level of due diligence that any publisher looking to use one of those services should go through. And then the final copyright question for any of them is as regards the output that comes from them. In some cases, they are generating things like a manuscript or a cover or other things that we want to assert copyright on. And so in those cases, we have to be much, much more careful. On the other hand, there are entire classes of AI output that publishers would use, things like metadata, keywords, emails, internal processes, where we would not typically assert copyright on those. So there's a little bit less of a concern if the thing that comes out isn't copyrightable. So, sorry, all of that is to say in summary, for any one of those, think carefully about your own use, what you're looking for it to do, and any service that you are paying money for like those, it is your right as the customer to ask difficult questions of the vendor about how it works, and they should be candid with you on those points.
Good answer. Thank you. How do you recommend publishers safeguard current workers while creating opportunities for innovation beyond human capacity?
That's a great question. I think there's a really interesting balance here between kind of top down and bottom up in how you approach AI. I've seen, not so much in book publishing, but certainly in some related sectors, businesses that just get management consultants to come in from outside the business who will come up with a list of recommendations that are then implemented, but don't necessarily bear very much relation to the day-to-day work that people do. On the other hand, one of the best individual use cases that I saw came from the design department of a larger publisher. These folks had set up an internal program where representatives of each department would feed into the AI strategy. And this was an example of a representative on that group who came up with something that was a real frustration to him in his daily work. It took a lot of time, and it was replicated every time they did a book. Now, automating that process with AI has saved something like 30 to 40 minutes per book across several thousand books a year that that publisher publishes. So in other words, it is a non-trivial time saving. Now, this is my 28th year in the book business, but with 28 years of experience, if you'd offered me $1 million, I would not have been able to come up with that use case because I simply do not understand that person's role. It came about because someone who did understand their own role could identify an opportunity. So I think that it's really important that teams and individuals are involved in this in a collegiate way within their businesses, that they help to shape the strategy, that they help to shape the approach. And I think that is likely to steer this toward productivity benefit rather than more risky applications. There is still absolutely a role for top management, by the way. I'm not saying that everything should be done by the people doing the regular work. Senior management needs to support this. They need to champion. They need to provide budget and resource for this. But I think that balance where people are involved as a team is the right way to go about this. And by the way, management can start that process very straightforwardly by framing that this is about productivity benefit as opposed to simple cost saving.
Yeah, so a sort of collaborative team effort. Keep that
Ideally.
discussion open.
Yeah, and clearly that is significantly easier to do in a relatively small, close business. SMEs are often very able to identify these opportunities and move forward quickly. Clearly, as you move up the scale into very large or even multinational organizations, this becomes a much harder challenge to manage.
Thank you. Okay, I have a question from the chat. My company's proprietary AI uses gibberish text on images it creates. not English or any other language, but looks like words and half letters in multiple languages. This happens when we tell it to not include text. Is this a common problem publishers or AI users are encountering?
Uh, wow. Okay, thank you. That's a super interesting question, and the direct answer is no, I have not seen that directly. If I have to hone in on one word in the question that I heard, it's that word proprietary. Um,
Yes.
on the whole, the publishers that I've seen are working with commercial platforms, whether that be OpenAI or Google or others. And in that context, I certainly haven't seen gibberish on that scale. So I think I won't be able to answer this now, but I mean, I think if I was sitting having a cup of coffee with you, my next questions would be about that model, what it's based on, what the training data is, how it's being prompted, up to and including a system prompt level beyond the user prompts, to try and understand what's happening there. But it's not something that I've seen before.
Okay, thank you. Publishers are increasingly requiring a declaration of AI content from authors.
Mhm.
One, how might they check AI presence?
Mhm.
Two, how prevalent do you foresee this opportunity progressing in the publishing industry? So I guess detecting the AI presence.
Yeah. Okay. So, in his introduction, Tim mentioned that I'm a doctoral researcher and I have some limited teaching responsibility in a university as part of that. And um, forgive me if I told this joke in September, but not this academic year, but the one before was a really interesting time to be a teacher because ChatGPT was released toward the end of the autumn semester. And between the autumn semester and the spring semester, a really remarkable thing happened. Some of my MBAs learned how to write. I mean, I'm not joking. The standard of written work went up, over that holiday period. And I'm sure that a large proportion of that was AI being used. Now, the academic sector is very invested in this. They are trying to come up with robust solutions to detect AI. So the software vendors like Turnitin, who detect plagiarism, are pivoting to detect AI, but they're doing it quite imperfectly. First of all, these systems are not entirely accurate because you are effectively setting a probabilistic model to catch a probabilistic model, which is interesting. Um, I've seen examples where they are, no more than say 85% accurate. So in about 15 or 16 cases out of every 100, they are going to falsely accuse someone of having used AI. And there has been abundant coverage in the media of students who've been accused and have faced sanctions from their universities for this. It's not just that the systems are potentially inaccurate, but that they are also potentially discriminatory. There is good evidence that people who are writing in English as a second language, for example, are more likely to be false positived by AI systems than English speakers. So it's very unfair. In an academic context, therefore, we don't fully rely on those systems. The best they can do is give us a direction. It is likely that this is AI, or it is likely that this was written by a human being. And so for my students, we've pivoted to doing more oral presentations, more proctored exams. Actually, if you want to use ChatGPT all the way through the course, be my guest, but it's not going to help you in your final. Now, the challenge for us as publishers is clearly that we can't make our authors write their books in a proctored exam room. We can have software. So, for example, Storywise, the service that I mentioned, will give you a sort of a likelihood. It'll say it is likely this is AI, or it is likely that this is written by a human being. But it's no better than that. There is no technological solution that I regard as robust here. This is basically a human issue. If you If someone is determined to use AI in their writing and is not candid with you, it's quite likely that they're going to get away with that, particularly as AI gets better. Um, I think the best that we can do as publishers is set clear expectations of what we think is right. And those may vary according to your publisher. Different publishers have different points of view on this. But is there a clear expectation to your authors? Has that been communicated to them? Have you explained the why as well as the what? It's easy to tell people that we need this for this reason, but it's not just that we have this policy in the abstract. We have this policy because A, we want to be able to assert copyright on your work confidently. B, it is likely that downstream partners, whether that's Amazon or Ingram or Bookshop, are asking us for a declaration of what is AI generated versus created by humans. And so we really need to know the answer to that question. So I think this is really about the relationship between the publisher and the author and setting that expectation clearly. And by the way, the flip side of that is that if the publisher has a right to candor and clarity from the author, it's perfectly reasonable that the author should have a similar level of clarity from the publisher on how they are using AI.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was sort of what stood out for me in the U.S. copyright paper that just came out
Hmm.
was the idea that your prompts had to be declared. So it seemed like the onus again was just on sort of being ethical and reporting that AI had been used
Right.
for the
And the
creations.
the Authors Guild in the United States has just launched a certification scheme where effectively, as an Authors Guild member, you can register your work as being created by a human being, and they give you this nice little image that you can include on the cover as a stamp of approval, so things are clear to the person buying the book. But as I understand it, that scheme has the same basic problem of disclosure. They are reliant on the honesty of the people using the scheme.
Hmm. Always our weakest point. Um, that sort of leads into this question, actually, and you were alluding it. What are the rights of the book buyers with AI? When our customers ask if AI is used in the creation of a book, what are the consumer's rights?
It's a very interesting question. I mean, in terms of statutory legal rights, those are still quite emergent country by country. I expect that certainly in some parts of the world, we will see more restrictions on this and more of an onus on publishers to be clear about what it is that they are selling. I think what's very clear to me, looking at some marketplaces particularly, is that people are buying AI content already. Whether that is a something very minor, a book cover where generative fill has been used as part of a human-led design process, or books that are actually written with AI, or indeed other forms of products. In the audiobook market, we've long had this problem about availability of catalog, that actually a very small proportion of the print catalog is available in audio format, and it's quite expensive to record. And so, I know that there are many tens of thousands of commercial audiobooks available that have been recorded with synthetic voices. And sometimes, that is made very clear. The Publishers Association here in the United Kingdom has just published a piece of work, an excellent piece of work led by my friend John Watt, on the labeling of audio material. So there is an established standard that people should use to label what's narrated by a human, what's narrated by an AI, and what's narrated by a hybrid. We do not have any corresponding standards for print or ebook or other formats, and I would really like to see such things developed.
I'll just take this opportunity to say we have about 10 minutes left. And just if you want to raise your hand and hear your voice or show your face, feel free. Otherwise, keep sending in your questions. Okay, here's some more general and a more general question. What are the biggest challenges publishers face when integrating AI into their workflows?
I think it's a great question. The biggest single variable, I think, is the state of those workflows to start with. If the starting point is a reasonably clear, structured workflow, which is very standardized, then AI tools can often be integrated relatively straightforwardly. So, for example, I've seen particular success in educational and scholarly publishing, which tends to be very standardized and workflow driven. On the other hand, I've seen trade and consumer publishers where the output is much less standardized and where the workflow is still quite manual. And in those cases, it's much harder to get a consistent output from AI. So, first thing, what's the state of the current workflow even before you put AI into it? The second question, Tim, is something that you mentioned a few minutes ago, which is the question of quality checking.
Hmm.
You define what good looks like. What is an acceptable standard? What is the checking process? And I've been very clear for about 20 months now that human in the loop is the only way to go here. If, like Fable, your outputs are too large for human in the loop review, then you kind of need to be having a basic question about whether AI is a good idea to start with, because you may end up being tripped up. If you are doing something on a smaller scale, it's generally much easier to have that review, but it has to be there. You cannot trust systems 100%, even though they are getting significantly better.
Very good point. Sorry. How can smaller publishers and independent booksellers leverage AI without requiring large-scale investments?
It's a really great question. And I'm actually very optimistic about the potential for those kinds of very small enterprises to make the most of AI, because while they don't necessarily have financial resource and scale, on the whole, it's generally a small team. It's quite easy to work through what AI is going to look like, where it's going to be used. It's much easier to get alignment on the personnel and organizational challenges that come before any technology choice. Having done that, then the question is, what are the prerequisites to be able to experiment? And actually, they're pretty low. If you want to, there is a free version of almost every language model, and there are trial versions of many of the commercial services that I mentioned. Very often, the price of using a free service is your data. That you can use ChatGPT on the web completely free, but whatever you put in is going to be used as training data in future. But if you're prepared to make that trade-off, then you can use them free. On the other hand, I run my own business is a 3-person consulting business. We're pretty small, and we have a bunch of AI subscriptions, which do not cost us a vast amount of money. I don't know. I'm afraid I don't know Canadian prices off the top of my head, but here in the UK, we are paying the equivalent of $15 to $20 per user per month for access to most of the services that we use. And for very small publishers, my advice is normally, you can probably start with, say, a couple of users and see how you get on. Once you're on that paid tier, there is generally a much better set of data and privacy safeguards. You can lock things down, and whatever you put in is not going to be used to train the general model. So you can feel more confident doing that. So I think if the barrier to entry is either some of your data or, perhaps a few tens of dollars a month, that is hopefully something that's within the reach of even quite small organizations. And then having done the people side, having done the choice of tool, I think the next thing for those small organizations is really thinking about the use case and where AI comes in. a lot of the time people start trying to solve really, really big problems. One publisher that I know decided that they wanted to use AI to basically write a family of macros that would clean up incoming manuscripts. And that's a great and valuable thing to do, but it was necessary for them to work through that. My advice would normally be don't start with one of those really big tasks, but identify some measurable pain points that are maybe taking half an hour or an hour out of someone's week. Automate those first. By doing that, you will get the experience of using the tools. You will also build the confidence among your colleagues that there is value to this and that it's working. And you will hopefully then take people with you on that process.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Similar with software projects, we always suggest working, with a sort of use case, a smaller, uh, I guess a proof of concept almost, and then kind of building it out.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I mean, the great thing is that you can absolutely develop iteratively. You don't have to start with every single thing, but okay, I have this big set of data I want to work with. The first thing I want to do is just answer one question. Okay, when I've done that and I'm confident in the output, let's then add a second stage where we're going to take that and we're going to work with it in some way and build up that way iteratively over time. And again, that can be really effective.
I guess there's a sense of urgency around a lot of this stuff since there are so many models coming out. There's so much news all the time with AI. Oh, the Grok is now the fastest, best.
Yeah, yeah. Grok and DeepSeek, and there's a lot of headlines. And I guess, look, I'm trying to be a grounded optimist about AI. I think that there is a lot that it can do, but I think that we need to be aware of the issues at the same time and sensitive to them. And I think one of the worst things that people can do is kind of chase headlines or race off in pursuit of goals here. You know, yes, there is an impact. Yes, this can be really good for you. But, unless you've genuinely got someone breathing down your neck and saying that it must be done now, don't rush into this. Do this in a deliberate way. Take people with you. Measure the before and after so you have the confidence that this is working and that you're getting the ROI from your activity.
Makes sense. And I think this might be our last question. It's 2:57. Uh, do you have any suggestions for assessing our use of AI and its environmental costs, like an AI carbon footprint?
So this is a really important question, and it's a very, very hard one to answer. I mentioned my own small business, and because we are fairly intensive users of AI, I have looked particularly hard at this myself. There is quite bad transparency from all of the AI platforms, in my opinion. They're not very clear on this. We know that there is a non-zero impact. We know that it may be substantial. There is a real debate among researchers as to how serious it is. I think what I keep coming back to is that kind of any strategic or economic choice we make has got some kind of impact, and we have to weigh the trade-off of it. Putting a physical book into the world has an impact, and I'm sure, all have made the decision that the societal benefits of that book outweigh the cost. But you kind of need to weigh that up individually, and different businesses will be very different. A very sustainability minded B Corp is going to have to take this much more seriously than a very commercial publisher that isn't explicitly tracking those things. So there is an absence of data. I think we have to keep calling for it as customers. I think we have to ask, as citizens, we have to ask government to ask AI companies for this. But I'm afraid that's probably the area where I can give the least satisfactory answer right now.
It's fine, because I do have another question for you. There's still a couple more here. Do you have any thoughts on Jasper as an AI tool?
Oh, sorry, was that Jasper?
Jasper, yes.
Yeah. So Jasper, which is, I believe, largely a marketing automation platform, is used by a number of actually quite large multinational publishers. I have not used it myself, but I hear good things about the the defaults for data privacy and some of the safeguards that are built into it. And I know that some very hard to please people have looked at it and found that it is fit for purpose. So I think it, from my understanding, it's a pretty robust solution.
Thank you. And then I guess one last question we can sneak in. Is there an AI tool that you think is worth checking out first for a small publisher?
Oh, okay. That's a really hard question. That's like my favorite child. Okay, so for my own personal use, I tend to say start with either ChatGPT or Claude because they are good all-round tools that can do quite a lot of things quite well. So I think that's a really good, solid starting place for most people. They're relatively inexpensive and they're relatively easy to play with. Yeah, yeah, happy with that. Unless you're doing anything visual, in which case I would say Adobe Firefly, which again is
Hmm.
pretty commonly used and also a really robust thing.
Thank you very much, George. Thank you for joining us today.
Not at
Uh,
all. It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me. Forgive the second commercial message, but please subscribe to my newsletter if you'd like to keep
Absolutely.
on things. I've put the link in the chat. I really appreciate so many of you taking time out of your afternoon. And thank you very much again to everyone at BookNet Canada for inviting me and organizing this. And thank you very much, particularly to the ASL interpreters for keeping up with all of this. I really appreciate your work.
And before we go, we'd love it if you could provide feedback on this session. We'll drop a link to the survey in the chat. And please take a couple of minutes to fill it out. We'll also be emailing you a link to a recording of this session as soon as it's available. To our attendees, we invite you to join our upcoming session, Elements of Indigenous Style, Insights and Applications for the Book Industry, scheduled for February 28th. You can find information about all upcoming events and recordings of previous sessions on our website, bnctechforum.ca. Lastly, we'd like to thank the Department of Canadian Heritage for their support through the Canada Book Fund. And thanks to you all for attending. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye now.